Have you sorted your fabric scrap strategy yet? Today's episode is Scrap Strategies Part 2, and we'll be discovering more systems, solutions and uses from the Check Your Thread listeners. Then we'll summarise all we've learnt in both these episodes to help you choose what's best for you. Welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 15 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, New Made May. But, like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and I'm looking at the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. Hi gorgeous listener, how are you doing today? I'm doing okay. I'm recording this intro on Sunday and I'm tired and it's raining, but I've got a massive urge to go foraging for wild garlic. I don't actually know where there would be any within walking distance of my home, so I probably won't go, but that's what's on my mind. So thanks heaps to everyone who's contacted me or left a comment somewhere lately about recent episodes and the topics we've been covering. Your comments and feedback is so wonderful to receive. So here's a comment that was left on the Check Your Thread website recently in relation to the second episode with Stephanie Canada about sewing precious fabric. So Jen says, the closest I have to any vintage fabric came from my mother's stash. I inherited it about 20 years ago. Her stash wasn't big. I think she only bought fabric when she actually had a plan for it. But in amongst her stash was a smallish piece of bright canary yellow net. In 1974, she made me a romantic tutu from this colour net for my ballet concert. I don't have the tutu anymore. I don't even have a photo of me in it. But I did find a photo online of someone else who was wearing the same tutu in my concert, and it matches my memory of the tutu. I can't see myself ever using it for anything, it's too small, but there's no way I'm going to throw it out either. Thank you so much for that comment, Jen. And it's so lovely that you still have some of that fabric. So here's my thoughts on what to do with a fabric that has a memory attached to it, so you want to keep it, but for whatever reason, you're not actually going to sew with it. I don't actually think that a piece of fabric like that should actually be in your stash at all. I feel like that is more of a memento than fabric. I feel that should be kept somewhere else, like in the place where you keep things with special memories, you know? Anyway, thank you so much for sharing that. So listener, have you got a sewing project on the go at the moment? I'm finally working on a couple of projects that I cut out literally about a year and a half ago. So I planned to make my kids a bag each 2 Christmases ago. And for whatever reason, I didn't get round to the actual making part. And I've been feeling really guilty about it ever since. So before I launch into another project, I've found the pieces and I've started working on them. So they're both circular shaped bags with straps that are going to go across the body. I'm doing some applique on the one for my son that's going to make it look like a Pokeball from Pokemon. And my daughter's is like a bright yellow twill. And I'm going to get my screen printing kit out and I'm going to print a smiley face on it with black ink. I'm hoping that they'll turn out really cute. And I'm also hoping that my son's one will help him keep track of where his purse is, because most of the time he has no idea where it is. Right, I'm going to talk about a sustainability win that is actually something that's kind of ongoing. And because it's ongoing rather than a specific action or series of actions, I don't think I've actually mentioned it properly before. So, by way of an explanation. So, my family doesn't have a car. I'm the only person that has a driving licence anyway, so my husband has never relied on a car throughout his life anyhow. I've been able to drive since I was 19, but I've actually only had a car that I've been responsible for maybe a maximum of like 4 years in my entire life. Anyway, currently we live in a town that's on the edge of a city and it is blessed with great access to fairly reliable public transport. So we can get to most of the places that we would want to go by walking or by bus or by train. And on the rarest of occasions, we might get a taxi. So we don't have a car because we don't really need one. Plus we couldn't really afford to run one at the moment anyway. But there are still times when access to a car would be super useful, like when we have stuff to take to the tip, or more recently when my kids are going to a Beavers or a Cubs activity. Those are like almost always in a field somewhere that you just can't get to by bus. So I have a neighbour who has a car that she very rarely uses. So most of the time she gets to work using her scooter. It's easier and cheaper for her to park a scooter in the city rather than a car. But she still has a car too for other stuff, like when she takes her dog somewhere or whatever. So anyway, she was complaining that her car wasn't getting much use. And I was complaining that I couldn't get my kids to some event that was taking place in some woods somewhere. And it just clicked that maybe I could get insured on her car and I could borrow it sometimes. So she contacted her insurance company about a year ago to see how much it would cost to add me as a named driver. And the quote came back that it was going to be less than £4 for the whole year. So I'm insured on my neighbour's car. And the arrangement works really well. I get the use of a car when I need one without the expense of having to hire one. And her car gets more use than it otherwise would. So it's not sitting on the road literally for weeks on end. So it's a win-win. And it's a sustainability win because it's keeping her car in a bit more use. So it's not going to deteriorate so quickly. And we don't then have a car. So that's one less car that otherwise might be on the road. So how it works is if I need to go somewhere, I message her to see if it's free, and it usually is. And then if I've gone somewhere further than just around the corner, I pop some petrol in it. I always offer to contribute to the MOT or servicing costs, and she always says no. So I always make her some biscuits or offer to mend her clothing or something instead. But it's an unusual arrangement for people in our society today, I think. Like, we've been taught that every household should own everything that they will ever use. And like, sharing resources is something that we're discouraged to do because it just doesn't really align with our consumerist culture. So we're seeing pushback here and there, I think. Like, there's a current growth in the interest in like lending libraries and the library of things, and in swapping and sharing apps and websites. They've always been there, of course, but I think that there's a renewed interest in them at the moment. And that's really cool because I think people are questioning, like, do I really need to own all this stuff? Like, is this stuff serving me? Like, it's just another thing that I have to maintain and pay for and house and, you know. So, yeah, so that's really exciting. But I don't think that the interest in it is really that widespread yet. Because I think that so many people are still under the illusion that to borrow something rather than to own it outright is kind of weird, or it signals that you're poor or you can't properly provide for your family, or I don't know, something else. Or maybe it's the lack of convenience of like not always having something there exactly when you might want it, you know? But yeah, anyway, so one day I might have to own a car again myself, but I'm so not desperate to. I really like that there's currently one less car on the road, and I wish that more groups of friends or neighbours or family members considered sharing a vehicle rather than having one per person or one per household. Like, yeah, it takes some coordinating, and obviously if you use a vehicle every single day to get to work or whatever, it might not be viable. But for others, I think it might. So yeah, so there's that. My sustainability fail is I have not borrowed my neighbour's car to take all the decluttered belongings out of our hallway yet. I've still got all the small electricals to go to the tip and boxes of books to be donated. There's one of those like free libraries for books in our local park, and we take a handful to that every few weeks when there's space. But some of our books are like super niche, so I think it's probably better for them to go somewhere where lots of people will see them, you know, like in a charity shop, because then I think that I'll have a better chance of finding an owner that would really want them. So that's something I still have to do. Massive thanks this week to new patrons Louise, Vanessa, Dawn and Lauren. These lovely people signed up to support the podcast via Patreon in the last 7 days, and I am enormously grateful. So if you enjoy Check Your Thread on the regular, the absolute best way to ensure new episodes drop into your podcast feed each week is by signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. So you can do this, I'm sure you've heard me say it before, but for literally any amount that fits in your budget. So many use the guideline of the price of a cup of coffee each month, which totally makes sense because this podcast is entirely fueled by caffeine, if you can't tell by how quickly I'm talking right now. But you really can just sign up for £1 or $1 or €1 or another currency. So please find the link in the show notes on your podcast app right now or on the website checkyourthread.com. Okay, it's today's episode. So I want to thank everyone who so kindly sent in their responses to the prompts about fabric scraps. I've already heard from some people saying that last week's episode has helped them define their own strategy for scraps. And we've got another batch of awesome ideas coming your way right now. So until next week, take care of yourself, take care of your loved ones, And please take care of those in the wider world who could really use your help right now more than ever. And enjoy! Scrap strategies. The story continues. In last week's episode, we heard from a number of awesome listeners who shared their own responses to 4 scrap-related questions. To refresh your memory, they were: what types and or sizes of fabric scraps do you usually keep? What is your system for storing them? What do you do with the scraps that you don't keep? And what are your favourite or most common uses for fabric scraps? This week, we're going to hear more interesting responses that may inspire you. Plus, I'll wrap up and summarise the responses to those initial questions and help you come away with a strong sense of what you want to do going forwards. But to reset the tone and get us back into the scrap strategy headspace, let's be reminded why we're even talking about this topic.
Hello Zoe, this is Saskia, the fighter, and I live in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. So I thought I'd leave you a message, but actually I need this episode because I don't know. I have reorganized my stash listening to your episode about organizing it seasonally, and I love it. But ever since, my scraps in baskets are on the floor and I need your help. I don't know what sizes to keep, as I would love to be a quilter, but I am not just yet. And I have so much to sew before I will even get to the scraps. I don't make children's or babies' clothes. I'm not about to become a grandparent anytime soon, hopefully. And I just can't think of anything to use small scrap for. I don't make stuffed animals or cushions, but I feel really bad about throwing them away. I would love to hear the other people, their ideas and your ideas, of course, to know what to keep actually and what to let go of, and I feel good about that as well, or at least neutral and not feel guilty. Please help.
So let's get into some more responses that may help Saskia and the rest of us.
Hi Zoe, this is Biz McKilligan from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. I'm a quilter and I'm a scrap quilter, so I actually love using up the little bits and pieces of fabric. I will keep anything as small as 1.5 inches square. The stuff that I keep, I usually only have stuff for projects, but for the other stuff that I keep it in clear bins so I can see what's inside it, and I sort it by color because that's the easiest way for me to use it. For the stuff that's too small to use, I will set it aside, and when I have enough, I will use it to stuff things. Typically things that you don't mind being a little bit more dense or heavy because it's not soft and squishy. So one thing that I've had great success with stuffing is yoga bolsters. It's perfect because you need it to be nice and firm.
Hello Zoe, and check your thread folks. When Zoe put out the call on Patreon for people to record voice notes about their use of scraps, I was like, ding, 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 jackpot, this is my specialist subject. So I've experimented over the years with lots of different ways to use up my scraps, and actually the most effective way that has probably lasted the longest is to use them as interfacing. So I long ago stopped buying iron-in interfacing, the type that has the sort of glue on one side and you iron over the other side. And instead, I basically use sew-in interfacing for all of my projects now. And I just take scraps out of my scrap baskets and cut interfacing pieces out of them. So I roughly divide my scraps into fibre type. And then with cotton, I also have a sort of heavier weight and a lighter weight basket. I don't tend to keep anything over about a couple of inches square because for me personally, I'm just not interested in sewing with bits that small. And anything that's too small to be useful, I bag up and I put in the textile recycling. You can put textile recycling in those car park bins that you see for like Bernardo's or Oxfam or Salvation Army. When you look on their websites, they will take textile waste, like clean rags, you're supposed to label the bag as rags. And my understanding is that material gets sort of heavy duty boil washed and then shredded and turned into like mattress stuffing and the stuffing inside like car seats. Other than the actual websites for the recycle bins themselves, I've never actually come across sort of official text on this, but that is my understanding from sort of a few years back when I looked into this. So I've been doing that for years now. Fingers crossed that's the right thing to do. But I do think that the government and local authorities need to do a lot more to make textile recycling more accessible, because the fact that this info is so difficult to find, even for people who are genuinely interested, means that folk who don't really care that much for whatever reason, that's how people just end up putting their textile waste directly in the landfill. And it's obviously like a huge environmental issue, but also it's a real shame. Like if charities can use that valuable resource and it can be recycled and make money for the charity whilst also creating a reusable resource for a different industry to use, then that just feels like a no-brainer to me. So I don't really understand why that's not better advertised. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. Thanks so much, Zoe, as ever, for everything you do for our little community. Bye.
Okay, Abigail. I'm Abby and I live in northeast USA. My favourite thing to make with scraps is tote bags, because it's okay if they come out looking a bit funky. I keep most scraps bigger than about 3 inches square, and recently I created some pieced tote bags from scraps. I divide my scraps based on colour and try to stick to a limited palette with no more than 5 distinct fabrics for each bag to keep things somewhat cohesive. I pieced rectangles together in pairs and then add a third rectangle crossways to create blocks of 3 fabrics that I then piece together in strips and join up to make a big rectangle that I trim to size to make one side of the bag. I hope that makes sense. I saw the technique on one of the Thread and Sprout Instagram stories a while ago, and I like how it adds a tiny bit of method to the madness. I line the bags with quilting cotton or lightweight pieced scraps so I don't have to worry about the guts showing.
Hi Zoe, it's Polly and I am in Portland, Oregon, USA. That's in the Pacific Northwest. What types and sizes of fabric scraps do I usually keep? I keep all sizes, and I keep the scrap of everything I cut because I might need it sometime or I might be able to use it sometime. I'm fortunate to have a studio, so I have drawers in the studio, and for the smaller scraps go in those drawers. I keep thread scraps, and if they're long enough, I use them for basting or for decorative stitchery. Otherwise, I keep them in jars and mash them down, and someday I think I will use them for stuffing pin cushions and things like that. I have a nice box of scraps I call small art fabrics, which are like quilting cottons and other kinds of things that I either only bought a little of or they're scraps of other things. And I use those for trim and applique. I use knit scraps also to make binding and to make cuffs on thrifted garments that I'm upcycling for art to wear. And I consider all my scraps to be latent art supplies, though I suppose at some point I might have to stop saving them if I'm not really using them for things. Thanks for asking.
Hi Zoe, it's Liz Reed here, and I'm answering your questions about fabric scraps. I only tend to work with cotton and linen fabrics. In terms of sizes, I probably will keep anything bigger than 1 inch square, maybe a little bit smaller than that. Once they get to a scrap size, I've got 3 boxes that I put them in, which are split between cotton, linen and flowery, although flowery might be anything that's patterned. And if the scraps will fit in the box flat, then they go in the scrap box. If they're bigger than that, they go into a medium-sized box. God, I hope that makes sense. What do you do with the scraps that you don't keep? I have a compost bin in my workroom, and if they're cotton or linen, I put them in there and they go in the compost bin. If I think they've got any polyester or man-made fibres in them, they go into a textile bag, which my vision is to make draft excluders with, but there's a lot of draft excluders worth in that bag. I've only managed to make 1 draft excluder so far. What are your favourite or most common uses for fabric scraps? I tend to make little mini quilts, so I might piece smaller pieces together for the quilt top, find a bigger piece for the backing, and then they could be any size, and then I use them for like table or furniture protectors, mostly for putting house plants on, because that's become another obsession of mine. But because my dad was a cabinet maker, a lot of the furniture in the house is quite precious. Anyway, thanks for asking the questions. I hope that all makes sense. Take care, Liz.
Okay, from Caro. This isn't a strategy, but keeping scraps from things I made has meant that many years later I was able to change the sleeves on a dress because I never liked them and add cuffs to a long sleeve shirt because they're a bit short. I took these steps because Check Your Thread has helped me to think far more deeply about the resources we use in sewing.
Hi, this is Mary. I live in Lawrence, Kansas, USA. I keep everything. A ridiculous amount of everything. I keep my thread, tails, I keep every tiny little scrap. I try to save them in separate places, so I keep a couple of little bins next to my sewing machines so that my thread goes in one and little scraps go in the other, and then bigger scraps go in another bag. In my closet, I have a ridiculous amount, and I also keep forgetting what my organizing method is. But one thing I just realized is, and this is partly because you asked, what do you do with the scraps that you don't keep? I really do keep everything. And then I feel guilty about it. Every now and then I throw something away. I try and compost. But what I realized is, if I think just visually of how big my pile of scraps is and how big my pile of things I have made over, the same amount of time as I've been saving scraps, the balance is I have made tons of stuff and I don't really have that many scraps. So I'm still going to keep saving them, but I'm also going to try to maybe be less compulsive about how much I keep. Okay, bye.
Okay, this is from Rachel. I don't have the space to store small scraps, but I do have a friend who quilts, so I keep a pile of scraps for her. I'm mindful of just passing a problem on, so I do throw out small or oddly shaped scraps that won't get used. I only keep usable sized scraps in my stash, like the size of A4 paper or above. These can be used for pockets, little bags, etc.
Hello, my name is Mel and I live in Woking, Surrey. I tend to keep all my cotton scraps and I make bias binding from them, which I put around the inside of my trousers, or I make little tags so that I can hang my garments up by a hook. I use them for pocket linings, all sorts of little things like that. Thank you.
Okay, this is Corinne. Corinne says, I usually keep scraps bigger than 5 centimetres by 5 centimetres. Everything smaller goes into a bag that will be used for filling a cushion later. Everything bigger goes into a rather small box. When the box is overflowing, I know it's time to do something about it. I then sort the scraps according to fabric type and try to piece them together. Here I find that shape is the most challenging because fitting 2 pieces together requires cutting them up and in turn generates smaller scraps. So I try to find matching shapes and piece these together, but I'm not sure yet that I like the look of it. Looks a bit like improv quilting, which I would not feel comfortable wearing as clothes. I also must say that I make my own layout when cutting out a pattern in fabric and specifically aim at minimising the size of my scraps. If enough fabric is left over from another project, I keep decent scraps, 10 cm by 10 cm and bigger, with the original fabric, so this doesn't fill up the scrap box too quickly.
Hi, my name's Nicole. I'm from Michigan in the United States, and I wanted to share about my scrap storage technique. Years ago, I had a big tote full of scraps of all sizes, from a quarter to, a half of a yard, and I never used it because it was a pain to dig through. I went through it all a couple years ago and folded all of my pieces that were fat quarter size and larger, as you would fold a fat quarter, and put it in an open face tote under my sewing table or my cutting counter and have baskets for everything else, and I sort them by color. as I cut out my pattern pieces. That way I don't have to dig anything out. They're right there, and I have found that I'm much more likely to use them for applique and mending and whatever else I might want them for. My smaller pieces, the tails, the salvages, I have a paper bag that everything goes into. The plan is to use it for stuffing, but I've been finding that maybe I want to use them for applique or rug making. We'll see what happens with that. Anyway, thanks. Bye.
Sharon. I'm Sharon and I live in the US Pacific Northwest. I keep all my scraps in various bins. Not the best system, but my main scrap busting project is rag rugs. I first heard about them on the podcast and find they're perfect for garment offcuts, which tend to be long and thin. I braid them together and sew them into a spiral. There are other styles where you weave the pieces into burlap, but I prefer the sewed spiral method. They're easy to make and have made my sewing very near zero waste. Right, just to throw my own tuppenny worth into the mix, here's my current scrap strategy. I keep almost all of my scraps and leftovers that are approximately 15 centimetres or larger, so big enough to form a patch on something, or any strips that are large enough to make a scrunchie from. I sort mine by fabric type, because for the type of projects I tend to use them for, fabric type is almost always the most important factor for me. The colour and print is usually secondary to the success of one of my scrap busting projects. I have various tubs and carrier bags for my scraps. There's a stable wovens tub, a single jerseys tub, a Ponte Roma and double knits tub, a slinky wovens tub, so that's viscose and tencel, a carrier bag for non-stretch denim, a carrier bag for denims with stretch, a couple of carriers for sweatshirt knits and one for ribbing. Anything smaller, like scrappy bits, goes into a bag or two that live directly under my sewing table. So my favourite uses for scraps that are sorted by type is piecing them together to make clothes. But that's what next week's episode is all about, so I won't say anything more about that right now. I also use scraps, as many others have said, for pocket bags and facings in garment projects. I make accessories like bucket hats, hair scrunchies, headbands, zip pouches and purses as well. And also for making patches when mending. It's so helpful when I find that I actually kept a scrap of fabric that I can use to patch the garment that I made with the very same fabric. It hasn't happened often, but it's very pleasing when it has. I also love Amy's idea of using scraps and leftovers as interfacing. As for the very tiny scrappy bits in the bags under my sewing table, I did make the closet cold proof with my daughter during lockdown. However, it kind of ended up losing its shape and spreading out, and it just took up way too much space in our small living area. So I donated it to my kids' school for their reading area. Since then, I've made a draft excluder and a couple of cushions, but the cushions aren't very comfy because, as Biz noted, they're very dense and not squishy. So I must admit that I have previously bagged them up and written fabric scraps on the side with a marker pen and put them in the charity donation bins. My thinking is that I know that the charities that collect clothing work with middlemen to get rid of the unsellable donations so they can be ragged. My hope is that my scraps will also get shredded and made into low-grade textile items and not end up in the sea or in a pile in Ghana or something. But I've been so inspired by a number of these messages, and I'm also looking into making a couple of yoga bolsters as well. I personally don't need one, but I'll ask around my friends to see if anyone wants one, and if not, I can offer it up onto my local free cycle. And in fact, I just messaged a friend who lives in a really drafty flat and asked if she could use a draft excluder, and she said yes. So I'll be working on that this week. Honestly, don't know if I would have thought to do that if I hadn't been working on this episode. So let's do a bit of summarising. What types and or sizes of fabric scraps should you keep? Well, that seems to massively depend on what you're interested in using them for. Maybe you're drawn to the idea of keeping everything, including threads and tiny pieces, so they can be used for stuffing. Or perhaps it's more realistic for you just to keep scraps that can form part of garments like pocket bags or binding. Or to make small projects, or that can be patched together for quilts or clothing, or used for mending. You might want to only keep lengths big enough for an entire garment and pass on everything else. So have a good think about what's realistic for your space and your interests. What is a good system for storing them? Right, so this is deeply tied to physical space as well, of course. Clear bins and tubs seem to be popular, so less time needs to be spent digging through opaque containers. But of course, that might not be viable for you and your space. Can you at least keep your scraps together in one place rather than spread over multiple locations? And can you label the containers if it's not possible to see at a glance what's in there? Then, how are you differentiating between the scraps? If you're intending on using scraps for a variety of projects and purposes, so you could keep your tiny scrappy bits and threads separate from the pieces that are a size of a patch or so. And then the pieces that can form some or all of a garment, keep those separate as well. Some subcategories might also be useful, particularly if you have a lot of scraps. Lots of you, including many that like to make quilts, tend to separate by colour or if they have a print. Or you might choose to categorise them via fabric type like I do. Whatever category system makes sense for you, think, do you just want to chuck them into the container, or iron each of them and store them flat, or bundle them up in some way? Okay, so what do you do with the fabrics that you're not going to keep? If the pieces you don't want to keep are at least big enough for patchwork, you could bag them up and then donate them to some kind of education establishment, such as adult education or a primary school or a nursery. Or you could donate them to your local quilting group or scrap or reuse store. Or maybe offer them up via Facebook or Craigslist or a Buy Nothing group or FreeCycle. If you can be bothered to do a little bit of measuring and photographing, you could also potentially sell the scrap bundles. Those options all give scraps a better chance at staying at their highest possible level of use. However, if those aren't an option to you, or the pieces are too small or tatty, then bag them up, write fabric scraps on the bag and pop them into a textiles donation bin. Just try not to send them to the landfill. What can you use your fabric scraps more? Holy shizzle, it might actually be quicker to list what you can't use scraps for, but I'm going to attempt to summarise. Right, remember, scraps might be big enough to use as they are, or you can stitch them together to make them bigger and potentially more useful. Right, so garment uses. Mending, such as patching. Cutting out pocket bags, facings, linings, bindings, contrast panels, or as an alternative to interfacing. Or piece them together to make fabric to form a garment from. We'll cover this in great detail next week. There's household uses. Piece scraps together to make cushion covers or floor cushions, dog or cat beds, draft excluders, poofs, meditation pillows or yoga bolsters, and then use all the little bits of scrap to stuff all of those. You could also make mini quilts, table napkins, placemats, cup coasters, hot water bottle covers, plant pot covers, fabric storage baskets, cases for your phone or small electricals, bookmarks, cup or bowl cozies, bowl covers, covers for your sewing machines, rag rugs, or simply use them as cleaning cloths. You could try your hand at the many types of patchwork and quilting. Remember, that doesn't have to result in a full-on bed or sofa-sized quilt. Scraps also lend themselves well to making accessories. All kinds of bags, plus pouches and purses of all kinds, including makeup cases, pencil cases, things to keep your electrical cords in, snack bags, glasses cases, you name it. Hair accessories, scrunchies, headbands, sun hats, scarves and cowls, washable menstrual pads. And what about making reusable gift bags or gift wrapping? There are probably a ton more uses, and I may have missed some from the listener contributions that I didn't add in this summary, so please take this as a jumping off point rather than an exhaustive list. So I really hope that these 2 episodes have been packed with ideas, approaches and inspiration for you. And I really hope that they help you make the most of what you already have, to make the most of what already exists in the world, save you money, and provide you with some fun sewing opportunities. But I want to give the last word to Lois. So Lois has clearly thought deeply about these issues and has a strong scrap strategy of her own. She also shares a lovely story that really brings us back to why all this matters and why we're exploring this in the first place. So thank you everyone who has contributed to the last 2 episodes by sharing your system strategies and experiences. And here's Lois.
Hi Zoe, it's Lois here in Vancouver, or Coast Salish territory on the west coast. And I guess I could say that I save all scraps. The tiny little ones, all the cuttings, even household textiles that can't be used anymore. They get cut up and all of that goes into these forms that I make for cushions. Yoga bolsters, dog beds, meditation cushions. So I always have a few of those in the sewing room and I stuff them with these bits. But otherwise, the smaller scraps that come from cutting away garment pattern pieces, I divide them into knits and weaves, and then they're sort of divided into colors, and I store them flat. So I take the time to kind of iron them out or, cut them a little bit so that they can be usable and stored in piles. And those are kind of in color ranges that work together. And I take the time to piece them once in a while. I used to only do this at the holidays over the New Year, just as sort of like puzzling, enjoying the process. But this year, I think I'm going to be doing a lot more of that because the piles are getting pretty tall and I'm in the last sew is standing challenge. So it seems like a good time to do a lot of patchwork or piecing. But some of the other uses of scraps, knits, they definitely get used. I make a lot of dish rags, shop rags, baby wipes. We just made a big roll of not paper towels that are going on the paper towel dispenser now. So I think we're finished with paper towels in this house. I made a lot of underwear, bottoms. I need to make a few more tops. I made a patchwork sweatshirt that worked really well. But still, there's a lot of knit scraps, so I'll be making a few more things there, maybe for other people, maybe for kids. And the wovens, they get used for repair and crafts. I like making bread baskets with them, textile containers. Oh, I love making gift bags, patchwork gift bags. That's one of my favorite. I've made a few pieces of clothing, house coats, house dress. And all of it kind of makes me think of this Jewish folk tale about the grandfather who makes a blanket for the grandson. And when it wears out, the grandson convinces him to fix it, and his version of fixing it is to make it into a little jacket. The jacket then becomes a vest, the vest becomes a tie becomes a button. The button eventually is lost and becomes a story. And I love that folk tale, and I guess the reason I'm telling it or retelling it is because I want to live in that kind of household where every bit of fabric is used. Nothing is thrown away. And that's my aim. Anyway, thanks for asking, and thank you so much for challenging us to be so sustainable with our sewing. Best wishes, everybody.
Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!